Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church, Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Charmley, and in this video I want to talk about an aspect of the history of our church. In particular, I want to talk about the first pastor of what is now Bethel Evangelical Free Church, Hanley. We've had over the years dozens of pastors. Some have stayed for just a few months. Some have stayed for decades. The longest serving pastor stayed for the best part of 30 years. Only one of our pastors has actually died while pastor, although one former pastor died during a visit to the church. And these men have varied enormously in terms of their backgrounds. We've had Scotsmen, we've had former missionaries, we've had men at the beginnings of their careers, men at the ends of their careers. We've had men who have been deep theologians, and men who have been fiery evangelists. But the first pastor was a man called John Greeves. John Greeves. Now, John Greeves wasn't with us for very long. Here he is. This is John Greeves. He was only with us for less than 18 months. He came to Hanley, rather, from Buxton in Derbyshire, where he'd been the minister at the Congregational Church. Now, our church, what's now Bethel Evangelical Free Church, Hanley, was established in 1810, and the first building was opened in 1812. It was a church that was founded by a group of people who left the old Tabernacle Congregational Church and started a new fellowship in a different part of Hanley, when in fact at that time it was in Shelton, but the boundaries have moved around since then. So the road that runs out along the front of the church is called New Hall Street, and that's because next door, where the former Tesco's building is, was the New Hall Pottery, but before then it was Shelton New Hall. It was a mansion, and 1810 they were selling off the grounds, turning the mansion into a pottery, selling off much of the estate, and part of the estate was called the Hall Meadow, and that was where the chapel was built, and that's where we still are, over 200 years later. Now, when I wrote the history of our church back in 2012 for the bicentenary, I didn't know a lot about John Greeves. I couldn't find a lot of information about him. I knew that he had been a minister in Buxton. I knew that he had become a Methodist, but I didn't know much more than that, and his obituary didn't go into a great deal, and that's all I could find about him. But then I found this book, From the Cradle to the Pulpit, Sketches of the Youthful Days of Some Wesleyan Ministers, by Edith Greeves, who was John Greeves' granddaughter. And Edith Greeves dedicates the book to her two grandfathers, John Greeves and Robert Young, Wesleyan Methodist ministers. The book was published by Charles H. Kelly in 1892. Charles H. Kelly was the book steward of the Wesleyan Methodists. In other words, he was in charge of the denominational publishing house, what later became Epworth Press, and he was an extremely capable man. He also wrote quite an amusing memoir. But in this book, Edith Greeves, drawing obviously upon information that she had, family papers, gives a brief sketch of the early life of John Greeves. John Greeves was born on May the 28th, 1791 in King's Lynn. His parents were good Christian folk. They were Calvinists. They sought to bring up their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. But they were relatively poor people. They were not people who could see any sort of great prospect rights for their son John if he remained in King's Lynn. At the same time, he had an uncle who was a London banker. And then, as now, being a London banker was a route to riches and importance, and concerned for the financial and temporal welfare of their son, concerned to give him a chance at a good, successful business career. When he was only 4 years old, he went off to live with his uncle in London. It may be that his uncle was childless, and that the understanding was that he would effectively become his uncle's heir. However, he seems to have been quite unhappy in that situation. It doesn't seem to be in a very spiritually helpful atmosphere, and you can imagine a little boy 4 years old suddenly taken away from the seaside, well, the little port town where he was, and King's Lynn was an important port. You can go there today, you can see the quay where the ships tied up, but there's nothing compared to London. London was, as it is today, the great city of the kingdom. And to go then from Lynn to London would have been an enormous culture shock for the boy. His uncle seems to have been a nice man, a pleasant man, a man who genuinely was concerned for the welfare of the little boy, but, well, it was a difficult society for him. And then, of course, he was sent to school, and he was sent to a boarding school at Twickenham Academy, and it seems to have been absolutely horrendous. The headmaster there was the kind of headmaster that you meet sometimes in older books, older works of fiction, as in Dickens. The headmaster who delights in flogging the little boys for the slightest offence. And here is this lad who, whatever he does wrong, and he does seem to be quite a high-spirited lad, and so he got into trouble occasionally. And whether it was his fault or somebody else's fault, out came the cane and the merciless flogging. It's no surprise that a boy with any kind of spirits would run away from such a school, and so he did 3 times. On the 3rd time, the teenage boy managed to get as far as Bath, but on his way, on the carriage, on the stagecoach out to Bath, he was taken very ill and stopped off at Berkhamsted. When the coach stopped at Berkhamsted, he wrote a letter to his aunt asking to have his clothes forwarded to an inn at Bath. Now, when he arrived at Bath, he pretended his name was John Smith, a really generic name, of course, and checked into an inn, went to the coach office to pick up the parcel, but of course his aunt hadn't just sent a parcel, she was there, and his uncle was there. And his uncle was more upset than angry. His uncle no doubt had realised that this wasn't the action of a boy who was just determined to be naughty, this was the action of a boy who was desperately unhappy at the school. And so they strolled around the city together, went to the theatre, and then his uncle took him back to London. And it seems his uncle had written to his father saying, look, it's not working out. I think John is desperately unhappy here. I don't think he's cut out for a career in the city. He should go back to King's Lynn. And he did, and he was desperately unhappy in King's Lynn as well. And so, even though he was put to an apprenticeship with a cabinet maker and upholsterer, and just a year later he quit and went back to London, seeking to do something. He tried various jobs. We're not told what they were, but he did all kinds of things. He became involved in amateur dramatics as a hobby. And then he got it in his head that because he was half decent as an amateur actor, he could make it as a professional. The London stage, of course, is famous today. But to get onto the London stage is a long and arduous business. And John Greeves initially entered with a company of travelling players, a little company who would travel around the various towns putting on plays in town halls and little provincial theatres. Unfortunately, he just wasn't cut out for the job. His health was not good enough. He found it was so miserable. All the travelling made him ill. He seemed to have suffered from motion sickness. And so eventually he quit and returned again to London. He had no career. He was still looking for what he was to do in life. He attempted to join the army, but the army rejected him because his health wasn't good enough. Even then, even when Britain was squaring up to Napoleon, still there had to be some basic standards of fitness for the army. And eventually he managed to get a job teaching at a school. He'd had a decent education, he was an intelligent young man, and so he became a junior teacher at a London school. And at that school he met a colleague, a man who he hadn't seen since Twickenham, a man called Mr. Jacques. Mr. Jacques was a Methodist. Now, Methodist in those days didn't mean what it means today. Methodist then covered a broader field, and it effectively meant the same as we would mean today by calling someone in Britain an evangelical. I understand that in the United States evangelical means something slightly different. But Jacques was a Methodist, and Jacques was also a good friend. And so Mr. Jacques one day said, "Look, if you're not doing anything on Sunday, will you come with me to my church, Sparfield's Chapel, out on what then was towards the edge of London?" Sparfield's had been a theatre originally. It was a great big building, a big circular building with galleries, and it had been a circus, and it had been turned into a chapel by the Countess of Huntingdon, who was the leader of the Calvinistic Methodists in London. Of course, the other great Calvinistic Methodist leader was George Whitefield. George Whitefield travelled between England and America. The Countess of Huntingdon being who she was, she remained in England, and she used her wealth and influence in society to found chapels in places like Bath, Sparfields, and so on. And John Greeves went along to the chapel with his friend Mr. Jacques, and he writes, "The discourse had no effect on me, but Mr. Jacques, conversing on religious subjects as we were returning, I related to him the experience of a sister, who at the age of 13 was seized with an illness which everyone expected would terminate in death. Yet she was so happy and enjoyed so much assurance of her acceptance in the Beloved, that she rejoiced the hearts of all who saw her." And Mr. Jacques was overjoyed to hear this, and expressed his sympathy and his joy that John Greaves' sister had died with such assurance of faith, had known who her Redeemer was. And it was this that led Greaves to think on himself, how different am I from my sister? What did she have that I don't? And so he says, I went home to pray and began to feel what a sinner I had been. And Mr. Jacques, and this is another interesting point, that although Mr. Jacques went to a Calvinistic Methodist chapel, he also attended what's called a class meeting, what we would call a small group meeting, at a Wesleyan Methodist chapel, namely Mr. Wesley's chapel in the City Road in London. And so the next Sunday, he took Greaves along to the class meeting. Now, the class meeting wasn't so much a Bible study as it was a meeting where people would share their experience and encourage one another and effectively it was a means of pastoral care. And he was asked in the meeting, as people did, to say, "Brother, what is the state of your soul?" And he says, "When asked the state of my soul, I could not refrain. In language interrupted by many sobs, I told them all. A fortnight afterwards, as I was going to class, praying for a blessing, my frame was filled with holy joy. My burden was removed. I felt that my sins, though many, were all forgiven." It was through that meeting with these men who would have been concerned for his soul, for his state, that he was converted. And after his conversion, he became a teacher in the Silver Street Sunday School that was connected with the Calvinistic Methodists. His uncle felt that the Wesleyans were quite disreputable, at least the ones he knew of, but the Calvinists were a bit more acceptable. He still continued to go to the Saturday night prayer meeting at City Road Chapel as long as he was in the London area. And he began to write down his thoughts. He comments in one extract from the diary, "The boys have been very troublesome, and my mind has not been stayed upon Emmanuel. O my Jesus, thou kind, indulgent shepherd, pardon and heal mine infirmities. What I know not, teach me, and put thy fear into my heart, that I may never, never depart from thee. For 2 weeks I have been without a sixpence, and last Sabbath went without my dinner. But I called upon the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me out of my distress. My uncle received me, and very kindly presented me with a £1 note." Another comment he makes that perhaps will strike many ministers is, "Loitered away my time at the bookshops. On my return from the service at Silver Street, I purchased Pilgrim's Progress, and my conscience greatly condemned me. This is with me a besetting sin. Help me to conquer it, O Lord, for Christ's sake. Amen." Can reading Christian books be a besetting sin? No, but he felt that spending money on books when he hardly had enough to spend on food was wrong, and it probably was. However, we understand that. Mr. Jacques eventually left the school and left Greeves as the only Christian teacher there, certainly the only Methodist teacher there, and he found his colleagues were increasingly unpleasant and rude to him. He was led, however, to the ministry, and again, because of his involvement with the Calvinistic Methodists, he ended up going to a congregational seminary in London. He did very well at the seminary, at the college, to the point that he attended only for about a year when the church at Buxton in Derbyshire extended a call to him, and they said, "We want you to come up and be our pastor." And so, after a couple of years in Buxton, he was called to the church at Hanley. No doubt he had preached for the fellowship before they had a pastor. No doubt he had been to the brand new chapel it had been then, preaching for the people, and they said, "Well, here is this very able and talented young minister at Buxton. Come over to us here, for we believe the Lord is calling you to be our pastor." He was there, as I say, for less than 18 months, because while he was in Hanley, he came into contact with the Wesleyans. And more he came to feel that he was more at home with the Wesleyans than he was with the Congregationalists. And so at last he gave his notice at what was then called Hope Chapel, and applied to the Wesleyan Conference in 1815 as a candidate for the ministry. I'm sure that they were overjoyed to have a man who had been to seminary. There were no Wesleyan seminaries then. A man who had already served in the pastoral ministry. A man who they could actually say, yes, this is not going to be another young man who fails. This is going to be a young man this is a young man we know he's a definite settled quantity. and he seems to have been very much at home among the Wesleyans. He went to Buxton for them, which I'm not quite sure the Buxton Congregational Church appreciated that, but that's how it goes sometimes. He ministered in various parts of Britain. However, his health didn't really hold up. And so for 31 years he remained a Wesleyan minister until, alas, his health failed and he died. And as he died, he had the satisfaction of knowing that one of his sons had just been accepted for the Wesleyan ministry. Eventually, 3 of them would become Wesleyan ministers, and 1 an Anglican vicar. So that was John Greeves. His picture currently hangs in our vestry. He was our first pastor. A man who came and then went over to the Wesleyans. A man whose life was varied to a great degree. A man of God. Well, I hope you find this useful. I know it's to a certain extent a little bit self-indulgent talking about the first pastor at Bethel, but it is of great interest. Well, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you. Amen.